The first warning was not the sight of an army. It was a sound. A low, dry murmur, rolling across wet fields like wind moving through dead grass. Thousands of bowstrings being drawn at once. Thousands of men holding their breath. And in front of them, a world that still believed war belonged to armored nobles on horseback. For centuries, the knight had been the image of power in Western Europe. Steel over bone. Land under name. A warhorse trained to crash through fear. A lance pointed forward like judgment. When knights gathered in formation, men on foot were expected to break, scatter, or die beneath iron hooves. Then the arrows came. They did not arrive like a single weapon. They arrived like weather. A dark, hissing storm that bent downward from the sky, falling so fast that no command could stop it, no courage could turn it aside, and no noble birth could make a man immune to its iron head. This was the terror of the English longbow. Not because it was new in the simple sense. Bows had existed since prehistory. Archers had served kings for thousands of years. But the longbow, in the hands of trained English and Welsh bowmen, became something different. It became a system. A machine made of wood, muscle, discipline, supply, and timing. It took the old order of mounted aristocratic warfare and forced it to stand still under a rain it could not answer. To understand why it mattered, we have to begin in a Europe that believed battle had a natural hierarchy. At the top stood the armored horseman. He was expensive to create and terrifying to face. His armor required wealth. His horse required land. His training began young and consumed years. In war, he carried more than weapons. He carried status. The battlefield was not only a place where armies collided. It was a stage where social order proved itself in blood. The knight charged because the charge was more than a tactic. It was an argument. It said that courage, birth, armor, and momentum could decide history. For a long time, that argument was persuasive. Infantry could resist, but often only under strict conditions. Spears had to remain steady. Shields had to stay locked. Men had to ignore the enormous animal coming toward them with a steel-covered rider above it. If they flinched, the line opened. If the line opened, the horseman entered. Once that happened, the battle could become slaughter. Across the Channel, however, a different kind of soldier was being shaped. In Wales and England, the bow was not merely a battlefield tool. It was a culture of practice. Kings encouraged, and at times demanded, that ordinary men train with it. The longbow was tall, often close to the height of the archer himself, made from yew when the best wood could be found, and drawn with a force that could deform the bodies of the men who mastered it. Archaeologists studying the remains of medieval archers have found strengthened shoulders, twisted spines, and enlarged arms. The weapon wrote itself into their bones. A longbowman was not made in a month. He was grown over years. The bow demanded strength, but strength alone was not enough. It demanded rhythm. The archer had to knock, draw, aim, release, and repeat until the act became almost automatic. In battle, when the air filled with screams and the ground trembled under horses, he had to keep that rhythm. Panic was natural. Rhythm was trained. The power of the longbow lay partly in range, partly in volume, and partly in the terrible uncertainty it created. Not every arrow punched cleanly through the finest plate armor, especially at long distance. Medieval armor was not foolish. It evolved constantly, and the best harness could turn many blows aside. But war is not decided only by perfect penetrations. Arrows killed horses. They found joints. They struck faces, arms, thighs, throats, and men with lesser armor. They wounded, blinded, pinned, and exhausted. They forced riders to lower their heads, bunch together, lose formation, and enter battle already shaken. The longbow did not need to kill every knight. It needed to break the charge. That was the quiet revolution. The knight was most dangerous while moving. Momentum made him a weapon. A horse at speed turned the lance into a spear of multiplied force. But once that motion slowed, once horses stumbled, once bodies crowded into mud, once the clean geometry of the charge became confusion, the armored noble became something else. Still dangerous, still brave, but heavy, trapped, and vulnerable to men he had been taught to look down upon. The English learned to build battles around this truth. Their armies in France during the 100 Years' War were often smaller than the forces opposing them. They could not always match the French crown and nobility in numbers of mounted elites. So they fought with calculation. They chose ground. They used stakes, ditches, hedges, and slopes. They placed longbowmen on the flanks where they could shoot into advancing formations. They dismounted men-at-arms to hold the center. They waited for the enemy to come. Waiting was a weapon. In 1346, near the village of Crecy, that weapon found its moment. The English army under Edward III had marched through northern France, pursued by a larger French force. The campaign had been exhausting. The English were far from home, moving through hostile territory, burdened with loot, animals, and the fatigue of constant movement. The French, led by King Philip VI, wanted to crush them. Nobles gathered from across the realm, eager to end the invasion and win honor in a decisive battle. To many French knights, the answer seemed obvious. The English were on foot. Their army was smaller. Their position could be attacked. A mounted charge, delivered with enough courage and mass, should finish the matter. But the field was not neutral. The English had taken defensive ground near a ridge. Their men had time to prepare. Their archers stood ready, with arrows planted in the earth before them for faster shooting. Their line was arranged not as a desperate crowd, but as a trap made of patience. The French arrived tired, angry, and disordered. The day had been long. Rain had fallen. Roads were crowded. Commands moved poorly through the press of men, horses, banners, servants, and noise. In front of the French knights stood Genoese crossbowmen, professional soldiers with powerful weapons of their own. But crossbows, especially in the conditions of that day, could not match the speed of the English longbowmen. Their pavises, large protective shields often used while reloading, were not properly forward. Their strings may have suffered in the damp. They advanced into a storm they were not ready to receive. The English archers opened. The sky darkened with shafts. The Genoese faltered. Some accounts describe them retreating, and then, in the chaos, being ridden down by the French knights behind them, who saw withdrawal as cowardice or obstruction. Whether every detail is exact or shaped by chroniclers, the meaning is clear. The attack began in disorder, and the disorder fed on itself. Then the knights came forward. Again and again, they charged. Again and again, the arrows fell. Imagine the scene from inside the French advance. The visor narrows the world to a slit. The horse breathes hard beneath you. Mud grips the hooves. Men press too close on either side. Ahead, the English line does not run. It waits. From the flanks comes the endless hiss of arrows. Some strike armor and glance away with a hard metallic snap. Others hit horses. A warhorse screams, rears, collapses. Riders tumble. More horses crash into them. The ground becomes a moving wall of bodies, steel, mud, and blood. This is where confidence begins to rot. The knight had been trained to believe in the charge. But a charge depends on belief as much as distance. Men must trust that the line will move, that the horse will carry them, that the enemy will break. At Crecy, the longbow attacked that trust. It reached the knights before the English men-at-arms did. It punished them while they were still approaching. It made the distance itself lethal. The French did not lack courage. That is one of the most important truths of the battle. They charged repeatedly into a storm that was killing them. Their bravery was real. But bravery is not the same as control. Courage can carry men forward into a bad plan, and once the plan begins to collapse, courage can keep feeding the disaster. By nightfall, the field belonged to the English. The losses among the French nobility were devastating. Names that carried land, lineage, and influence disappeared into the mud. The Battle of Crecy did not end the age of the knight in one afternoon, but it revealed a crack in the old order so wide that no serious commander could ignore it. Men on foot, properly positioned and disciplined, could defeat the flower of mounted chivalry. Not by miracle. Not by luck alone. By preparation, terrain, missile fire, and restraint. The longbow had shown that power could be redistributed. That idea was frightening. A knight represented investment. He represented a whole economic world: estates, tenants, armorers, breeders, squires, feudal obligation, noble privilege. A longbowman was cheaper, but not simple. He required training from youth, reliable supply of bows and arrows, organization in the field, and commanders who understood how to use him. The longbow did not make war democratic. Medieval society remained harshly unequal. But it did allow common men, standing in disciplined ranks, to influence the fate of kings. The weapon also changed the imagination of battle. Before the charge reached sword range, the outcome could already be turning. The psychological burden shifted. A knight could no longer assume that the hardest part began at impact. The danger now began in the approach, under a sky full of unseen decisions. Each arrow was small. Together, they became a landscape. Crecy was only the beginning of the lesson. 10 years later, at Poitiers in 1356, an English force under Edward, the Black Prince, faced another French army. Again, defensive positioning, dismounted men-at-arms, and archery created a brutal problem for French assaults. Again, the French nobility fought hard. Again, the result was catastrophe. King John II of France was captured, a humiliation of enormous political weight. The longbow had become more than a weapon on the battlefield. It had become a strategic threat. It could help a smaller raiding army survive deep in enemy territory. It could force a larger army to attack on unfavorable terms. It could turn noble aggression into vulnerability. And then came Agincourt. In 1415, Henry V led a tired, sick, and outnumbered English army through northern France. The campaign had already gone badly in many ways. Disease had weakened his men. Supplies were limited. The French gathered a far larger force and blocked the English line of march near the village of Agincourt. To many observers, the English should have been destroyed. But the ground was narrow. The soil was wet. The French attack was crowded between woods. The English archers planted sharpened stakes before them to deter cavalry and protect their positions. Once again, mounted and armored power was forced to move through a killing zone on terms chosen by men who understood patience. The French men-at-arms advanced through mud that clung to their feet and drained their strength. Armor that protected them also exhausted them. The press of bodies behind pushed men forward into those ahead. Breathing became difficult. Movement became labor. Then the arrows came, driving horses into panic, striking exposed points, forcing men to hunch and close their vision. The French front slowed, compressed, and lost coherence. When the lines finally met, many French fighters were already exhausted. English men-at-arms held them. Archers, having spent their arrows or seeing the opportunity, joined the close fight with mallets, knives, and axes. The image is almost unbearable: nobles trained for chivalric combat, trapped in mud, crushed by the mass of their own army, killed or captured by men whose social rank should have placed them far below the great names of France. Agincourt became legend because it seemed impossible. But it was not impossible. It was conditional. It depended on terrain, weather, preparation, discipline, leadership, and French mistakes. The longbow was not a magic weapon. It did not make every English army invincible. It did not erase armor. It did not win battles by itself. There were times when archers were vulnerable, when cavalry could reach them, when logistics failed, when commanders misused them, when changing armor and tactics reduced their advantage. That is what makes the story more powerful, not less. The longbow mattered because it was part of a system that exposed the weaknesses of another system. It punished arrogance. It rewarded preparation. It made old assumptions expensive. Behind every arrow storm was an enormous chain of labor. Bows had to be made, maintained, and replaced. The finest yew came from specific regions and had to be imported in huge quantities. Arrows required shafts, fletching, heads, binding, storage, transport, and distribution. A battle might consume tens of thousands of them. The apparent simplicity of the bow hid a world of logistics. War is often transformed not only by the weapon that appears in the soldier's hand, but by the society that can keep that weapon supplied. This is where the longbow belongs in history, between tradition and technology, between muscle and organization, between the old dream of heroic charge and the colder reality of coordinated fire. For the knight, the longbow was humiliating because it refused to fight on chivalry's preferred terms. It did not meet the lance with a lance. It did not ask for a duel. It did not care about banners, lineage, or ransom. It filled the air with force before the nobleman could display his individual courage. It turned the battlefield from a theater of elite identity into an environment of mass danger. That shift would continue long after the longbow's greatest days. Gunpowder weapons would eventually change war even more dramatically. Firearms required less lifelong training than the longbow and grew steadily more powerful. Artillery broke walls. Muskets multiplied disciplined volleys. Pike and shot formations remade armies. The medieval knight did not vanish overnight, but his world narrowed. Armor thickened, then disappeared from most soldiers. Horses remained important, but the unquestioned supremacy of the mounted noble was gone. The longbow was one of the early warnings. It showed that history does not always move through grand inventions alone. Sometimes it moves through an old tool used with new discipline. A piece of yew, a trained back, a commander willing to wait, a field chosen carefully, a line of men who do not run when the shining riders appear. And then the sound begins. Bowstrings drawn together. Breath held. Horses closing. Steel bright under a gray sky. For the men in armor, it must have felt like an insult from the heavens. They had paid for protection, trained for impact, inherited a world built around their charge. Yet above them, in the dim air, came thousands of small dark shapes, each one carrying the same message. The future was not asking permission. It was falling.